Well, welcome everybody to our spring clean your tenant. I know it's officially not quite spring yet. It's March 4th. We've got another, what's that, 17 days to go, but we're hopeful. I'm here in Canada. We got lots of snow and ice outside still, but there's hints that it's going and warmer weather is coming. So like around the house, we thought it was an appropriate time to talk about spring cleaning your Microsoft 365 tenant. How do you declutter, optimize, secure, for a bunch of different reasons. We'll get into that in a minute. But let me start with some introductions. So for those of you who haven't heard me speak before, I'm Peter Carson, president founder of Envision IT, also a Microsoft M365 MVP. Busy speaking schedule coming up this year. Looking forward to lots of travel and such from there. We are recording the session, so we're going to put it up and make that available for you. And we'll also put a copy of the deck up there as well. So all the links that you see in here, you'll be able to access as part of that. Also, president of the Toronto M365 user group, which we're actually just about to relaunch. We don't have a page in the deck here, but April 11th, if you're in the Toronto area, we're doing a community days event that you're going to hear more about over the next week or two as we start to roll that out. We just did speaker selections last night. We're getting the website up together and excited to get that going. Okay, so let's dive into our topic. And let's first clarify kind of scope of what we're looking at here. The M365 landscape is massive. I mean, this is not an all-encompassing set of icons of everything that's in Microsoft 365. You'll notice the three orange boxes around OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams. That's really what our focus is going to be here. So there's lots that you can clean up in your tenant. We're really focused on those pieces there, which really cover content and collaboration. So those are your file repository, your document repositories, where you're doing your sharing and communicating in teams around that. And that's where we see a lot of the sprawl. I mean, the amount of content that has been generating in Microsoft 365, and in particular in SharePoint Online on a daily basis, is just mind-boggling, like petabytes. And I don't know, the numbers are getting too big to even count anymore coming from Microsoft from that perspective. So if we're thinking about spring cleaning, where do we want to focus? If we're dialed down to those three areas, within those, what do we want to focus on? And within those, there's sort of three sub areas that we want to dive into. First is just too much content. We're creating content at a phenomenal rate globally, but even individually and within our organizations. And for some organizations, they're actually running out of storage from a SharePoint Online point of view, and that has a real cost impact to it. I'll talk in a minute of what are the costs of extra storage and what does that look like. But also out of date and orphan content, stuff that just doesn't belong there anymore. And if you're using Microsoft Search or you're maybe lighting up Copilot pilots, then those don't work well because they're finding stale content, wrong content. I mean, we saw that last year when we were first playing around with AI tools and Copilot. I was asking it questions and it was finding 10, 15-year-old content that was clearly out of date. And it didn't necessarily know the difference there. So it really wasn't answering the questions appropriately from that point of view. So if you want a successful Copilot, and that seems to be everything, the only thing that Microsoft's talking about these days, having your content cleaned up is a big step towards being successful from that perspective. Similarly, on the oversharing side, there's obviously the cybersecurity side to that, hey, if you've shared things, not just externally, but internally within your organization, where maybe you shouldn't and you didn't realize it, that's going to introduce security holes. And again, not to beat the Copilot horse too much here, those internal data leaks become an issue there. When somebody asks Copilot a question and Copilot does a search, because that's what it's doing behind the scenes to get that content. If it pulls in some content that maybe that person's not supposed to have access to, but they and the owner of that content both don't realize that they do have access, but Copilot doesn't know that, it'll answer that question. So you may find that, management level or higher sensitivity documents that aren't appropriate for people in the organization to see, but through some mistake or being overshared, Copilot's going to start answering questions with that content, and that can become a huge issue internally in the organization. So permissions is a big thing that you want to look at from a tenant cleanup point of view as well. And then unused accounts, again, cybersecurity, if you've got a whole bunch of accounts for, former staff that you haven't deactivated or deleted, service accounts, things like that, we'll dig into what that looks like. And you may be overspending on the licensing side. You may be licensing accounts that aren't actually real people in your organization, and it doesn't make sense to be doing that. So we're going to dive down into each of these three areas in sequence, and I start on the workspaces on the left to begin with. And this term, workspaces, is a term that we coined. It's not unique to us, but it's also not a Microsoft 365 term. And what we wanted was a single term that represented both Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive. You can have different types of workspaces within each of those, but really for purposes of tenant cleanup, what we're thinking about from a workspace cleanup point of view applies equally to all three of these. I'm going to talk in a minute about, or towards the end of the session, on our next session we're going to be doing in April on Teams First Information Architecture. I'm actually going to steal some slides from that deck, because I've given that at conferences in the past, to kind of explain what's underneath the Teams architecture, because it's important to understand this, to understand what's the impact on your tenant and how do you clean that up. So the first is understanding the relationship with Teams and SharePoint, because they are very much joined at the hip. If you have a chat with somebody through Teams, let's say I'm chatting Logan and I decide to attach a file that's on my local system to a chat conversation with Logan, that's actually going to put that file into my OneDrive for Business, which is private by default. Logan can't generally see that, but because I mentioned it through a chat with him, it's actually going to create a sharing link to Logan into my OneDrive just for that one file. And that's one of the ways that a lot of these shares actually get created from that point of view, is just the chats and the OneDrive connections. And that's an area that we're going to want to drill into from a cleanup point of view. If instead of just directly chatting Logan, he and I both belong to a sales team within our Teams environment in our tenant, I could mention him in a channel there. And again, maybe I attach a document to that. Instead of that going into my OneDrive, it actually goes into the team site that was created in SharePoint when we created that team, which is actually a little better because it doesn't create a sharing link. Logan has to be part of that team with me for me to mention him. And he already has access to that SharePoint site. So it just includes a link to that document that's been put into that SharePoint site. So that one's a little cleaner from a permissions point of view, but you'll still get sprawl if I keep attaching different named versions of the same file. I'll create all these duplicate copies in SharePoint, and that in itself can get confusing. And then you can also have SharePoint sites that aren't connected to Teams. You could have a communication site. The obvious example being, your corporate intranet is typically a communication site in SharePoint. But you can also have disconnected team sites. That could be a Microsoft 365 group. That could be an old classic team site that existed from before Teams and isn't connected to anything from that point of view. So there's a number of different sort of flavors of workspaces within the SharePoint realm from that perspective. And it even gets more complicated from that. I'm going to go deeper on this in the Teams Information Architecture webinar. But as you create different types of channels, like private channels or shared channels, they actually create their own site collections separate from the main site collection for the team itself. So you can see how this sprawl can sort of happen in the tenant and get out of control from that perspective, particularly if these teams, shouldn't have even been created in the first place. Maybe they're a duplicate team or they're an unused team, and suddenly we've got all these different entities that are spun up in your tenant. Does that need to be there? So the first step in kind of tackling this is understanding the scope of the problem. How do you do that? Well, there's a couple of ways you can do that. So we can do some inventory against the SharePoint admin. I'm going to share my screen into our admin in a minute to show you what that looks like. You could write some PowerShell to do that. We have a tenant dashboard that we've launched late last year that does a lot of that inventory work, and we're going to use it for a fair bit of our examples. But I want to be fair to the vendor community as a whole. Like, we're not the only player in this game. So let me just quickly take you through some of the ones that I know better and not so much. I mean, ShareGate we love and use on all of our migration projects, but they have a broader tenant administration component to their product. Honestly, I don't know it that well. I've just kind of dabbled in it a little bit, more so from a competitive point of view to understand where they're going. Same thing with AvePoint. They've got a broad suite of Microsoft 365 products, including insights that will look and give some analysis. Orchestra, you probably know best. We are an Orchestra partner. We've delivered Orchestra. In fact, the case study that I'm going to share in a minute for City of Greater Sudbury, we actually deployed Orchestra as part of that. And they've got good tools, not just from a reporting point of view, but a full life cycle and governance of creating teams and understanding, what's their life cycle, what happens when they're no longer needed from that point of view. Rencore, Syskit, BCC, I don't know as well. So some strong reporting on that side as well. Lightning Tools is more of an end user tool when we get into things like the sharing links. They've got a great tool called DeliverPoint that helps you clean those links up. You can actually delegate that out to the end users and let them do their own cleanup. And Bind Tuning, Beatrice, who's the CEO of Bind Tuning, and Carlos, their CTO, and I are going to be jointly delivering that next webinar in April on Teams First Information Architecture, because a big part of that is if you've developed sort of a target architecture, how do you automate the creation of workspaces, particularly teams, through that and apply templates and consistency and such from that. They have a product called Automate 365 that we've done a lot of integration into our products with that really helps from that process. So a bunch of tools to look at and things to think about from that perspective. But let's actually jump over for a minute to the out-of-the-box tools for a second. And I'm actually going to use our own tenant, which is a classic example of the shoemaker's children have no shoes, where we want to see what's going on in the tenant. So I've actually just spun this up. I actually used Automate 365 literally 20 minutes before this session to create an Envision IT client site in our tenant, because I want to explain how we engage with our clients. And I realized we didn't actually have ourselves in there to be able to show that. And I didn't want to share real client information as part of this. So in our new information architecture that I'll talk more about in the next session, we have Microsoft 365 groups created for each client. We used to create teams for each one, and that just got out of hand. We've got hundreds of teams, and it's sort of unmanageable for a company of 25 people. So we're collapsing and cleaning that up, but we're very much just starting that from that point of view. But one of the things that we have in here is the ability to see our tenant dashboard. So I've run this against our tenant, and full disclosure, we actually haven't done any cleanup yet on this, so we can see some of the things that it's calling out from a workspaces point of view. So the way the dashboard works is we have what we call our harvester that harvests the data from your tenant, puts it in a storage account that's dedicated to your tenant, and then we have a Power BI dashboard that surfaces that information up. And of course, it worked on the dry run, but now it's going to give me grief here. Actually, I think I have it open in one of these other tabs. I'm just going to go ahead and use this one as an example. Let me full screen this and show you what this looks like. So this is still very much a work in progress. Like I mentioned, we just launched this at the end of last year. We've been onboarding clients, and of course, as we started adding bigger clients in there, I mean, our tenant is not massive. We've got about 1 terabyte of storage, 150,000 files. The largest one we've done is about 20 terabytes of content and 1 million or so files in there. So it takes us about half a day to collect all the data, and that process happens in the background, and then we refresh the Power BI report. And honestly, what we see in this dashboard is very similar to what we're seeing in client dashboards as well, that overwhelmingly the majority of the workspaces, which would be the teams, the team sites, the OneDrives, the disconnected SharePoint sites, are inactive. And we've defined inactive as nobody's done anything in longer than a year from that. You can tweak those for your dashboard if you have sort of different metrics of what active versus inactive means for your business. But that's sort of typical of what we've been seeing, that 90 out of our 454, so about 20% of them are actually active workspaces. 56 of them are in that sort of 3 months to 1 year was the last time we did something with them, and the majority are in the inactive space. And we have to think about how does that break down across the different sites within that, and how much storage is being used, how much sharing links are happening from that. So we'll dive into those details as we go through. But let's imagine for a minute, I want to make sure that you get value from the webinar, that you don't have to use or buy our products to do this. How do you do that outside of that? So let's flip over for a second here into our admin console. So I'm going to use our tenant again for a second here. And this view here of active sites in SharePoint is actually a useful spot to see that. So I can see things like how much storage is being used on each site, and more importantly, when was the last activity. And I can actually export this to a CSV file. I can load it up in Excel, and I can start to create some pivot charts and pivot tables if you're handy with Excel, and you can do a bunch of the things that I was showing you in our tenant dashboard yourself, just as an administrator, and a little bit of Excel knowledge from that point of view. We just make it easier, and we actually collect some additional information that this doesn't expose, that you need to go to PowerShell to be able to pull in from that point of view. And I can see up in the top here, I always find this confusing. It shows you the available, not the use. You have to do a little bit of mental math and say, okay, that's 1.33 terabytes of storage that we're actually using, and 1.13 terabytes available in our tenant. And the way that's calculated, and this has changed over the years, is you get a certain base amount of storage for your tenant just by signing up. And even if you've only got one paid user in your tenant, you get a terabyte of storage for that. And then for each additional user that you license, you get additional data from that. And I know I had this in one of my slides. I think it's 10 gigabyte per user is what gets added in. Now we only have 25 staff. We've got a bigger number there only because we're a partner and we have lots of extra licenses and such. And that's part of what we need to clean up is getting rid of a bunch of those accounts that we shouldn't have in there from that point of view. But let's actually flip gears for a second here and talk about that case study. So City of Greater Sudbury, if you're not Canadian, may not know, it's for Northern Ontario, it's based about 5-6 hours north of Toronto in Ontario. It's quite a large municipality. It's about 250,000 people, I believe, about 5,000 employees across the municipal organization. And like most organizations, they started their team's journey a week, 2 weeks after COVID lockdown started, and just rolled it out across the organization. And everybody, did an awesome job. They had to scramble and support remote work. That was a brand new thing, but it came with a bunch of sprawl. So fast forward sort of 4 years from that into 2024, they approached us to say, hey, how do we get our arms around this problem? Our Microsoft 365 tenant is a mess, and we really need to organize it and sort it out. So we worked with them to build a Teams first information architecture, to deploy Orchestry from a governance point of view, and then work with about 60 different departments and kind of figure out, okay, who owns what, and what should we do with content? What sort of decisions do we need to make around that? And really, this came down to these things that we were tracking through Sudbury. We didn't have a tenant dashboard. We had PowerShell, we had Excel was kind of the tools that we were using on the product. And Orchestry didn't predate this. It was sort of new onto the scene, so we're trying to catch up and clean up, and then put the right processes in place going from there. So one of the keys, and Orchestry actually does a good job of this, is identifying workspaces that you're missing owners from. So maybe a team got created and then that person left the organization and they were the only owner of it. We call that a zombie workspace. There's no brain anymore. There's nobody owning it. It's just sitting there. And maybe it's actually still being actively used, which is an even bigger thing. Who that's actively using it should actually step up and take responsibility and say, hey, I can be the owner for this workspace. So ideally you want two people in that role to say, hey, if one of those leaves or changes roles where it doesn't make sense anymore, we've got a backup person. And when that happens, we should bring in a new second person as part of that. There's an obvious categorization to department to say, hey, what department owns this workspace? And maybe not every workspace has a clear department assignment, but the vast majority do. And that helps when you're having those conversations to say, hey, we're doing a review of this department. Which workspaces have we identified as belonging to that department that we want to make part of that conversation? Then you need to decide what action do you want to take, and there's going to be some inputs into the decisions there. Is this a valid active workspace that we should just keep, or is it a duplicate? Maybe we created two workspaces for the same project, and it's causing a lot of confusion. People aren't sure, do they go here, do they go there? can we consolidate that together into one workspace and do a merge and get rid of one of those as part of that? Or is it just not active, but the city of Sudbury is a municipality. They have to follow provincial guidelines around retention and freedom of information requests and such. They can't just willy-nilly delete things. They have to understand, from a retention policy, has it reached the trigger point that it should be deleted, or should it be archived and retained for some period of time as part of that? And tools like Microsoft Purview, we won't get into too much in this session here, are great tools for both defining and implementing policies around retention, which can apply to individual documents, but also to the workspace as a whole. And then assuming that spring happens every year, how often do you want to do reviews? We kind of encourage every 6 months would make sense. At the outside, maybe annually from that point of view. So understanding, when was the last review completed and who completed it. So a year from now, if we look at this, we say, hey, we decided to keep this workspace, but does that decision still make sense now, 12 months later, or maybe this should be archived, maybe this should be deleted? What does that look like? And maybe keep some notes around that. So we did this all in Excel. We haven't implemented this in our tenant dashboard yet, but we've been talking, Mark and Eli and myself, who are the senior consultants at Envision IT, a lot around, we've got a number of other projects on the fly on this same sort of tenant cleanup theme, and how do we want to best track this? And we're finding that a SharePoint list is actually a good place to keep this, because the harvester or your own PowerShell tools, if you wanted to, could update that list to say, hey, I see some new workspaces, some workspaces have dropped out because they've been deleted. How do I tidy that up and clean it up? It's hard to do in Excel because you've got all of your notes and actions and things recorded on that Excel. How do you refresh the set of workspaces and not lose those connections to that data? So let me actually pop into my local system here for a second. I've got some examples of this here. So I didn't use the site CSV pulled down from the admin console. This is actually the site's Excel that gets created by our harvester tool. So it's got all the same columns that the admin tool has, but it's got some additional ones around purview, around sharing capability, around default sharing links, around the template used. So we get some additional detail, the hub site that it belongs to, that we don't have in the out-of-the-box experience from that point of view. And then I said, hey, can we take this output and can we actually drop it into a SharePoint list? So let's see here if I remember where I've got that. So if I come over to my landing site, and I've got a workspaces list here. So I actually haven't extended it just yet, but I wanted to sort of socialize this idea. And if people have thoughts back, absolutely chat them back or reach out afterwards. So this is a bit of an ugly view here, but the idea would be to add columns to this list, which came from that source data, that we can record decisions like who's the owner, what's the action, what's the last review on that. And then we can refresh the list over time to say, hey, as we see new workspaces, add them in there, but not overwrite what was there previously. So all those actions and notes and things that we had on the pre-existing workspaces, we still have in there. In fact, the goal is to actually round trip that back into the dashboard itself. So you can actually show actions and decisions in the dashboard and use it as sort of a metric to say, hey, we've done the inventory, we've made a bunch of decisions, but maybe we haven't actually taken the actions on them just yet. How do we track our progress and what do we look for from that point of view? So coming back to, what are the things that we were looking for as we're making those decisions? So storage used is obviously an important metric, but it's not going to decide, it's going to influence. That concept of a zombie workspace, so there's no owners, does it really need to exist, or do we need to find some new owners for it? Or should it be deleted or merged or such? That duplicate concept there. The big one for me is actually that inactive, to say, hey, has anything happened in here in the last year? And what does that actually mean? It can mean a number of things. It could mean that some document has been touched and updated in the last year in that workspace. It could be that a conversation has happened in a channel in the team for that. So there's different things that we look at to determine what is that activity level. But one of the big drivers here, not just over proliferation of content and confusion and productivity impact, is actual real dollars from a storage cost point of view. So I explained how your storage allocation is determined. If you're not your SharePoint administrator and your tenant, you could ask your admin and say, hey, what is our allocation and how close are we bumping into that? Because we have had actually a number of clients now saying, hey, we're either about to bump into it or some of them have actually gone past and ended up having to purchase additional storage from Microsoft for SharePoint, which can get very expensive. $200 a month per terabyte. So if you want to add another terabyte of storage, and you can do it by the gig, you don't have to purchase a whole terabyte, but still that's $2,400 a month. And, a year times however many terabytes you actually need from that, it can start to become a significant cost. Now, if you compare that to Azure Blob Storage, which is also Microsoft hosted in the same data centers, but not nearly as friendly and experienced to access that content. So it's not something maybe your end users would be comfortable accessing. But let's say you have purview retention policies that say, hey, this needs to be archived, and that archive should go to a lower tier cost storage. Core archive tier in Azure actually have a significant difference in pricing. Cool means that you can live look at the content in that archive, given that you have access into the Azure Blob storage. You don't have to wait to retrieve the data. The archive tier, which is the lowest tier in Blob storage, you actually need to request they call it rehydrate the content. So Microsoft has it tucked away in some deep storage vault. Think of Iron Mountain in the old days when you sent the banker box to Iron Mountain. If you wanted to see a file in that banker box, you had to call them and they had to, get somebody to pick the box, put it in a truck and bring it to your office. There was a process. Blob archive is kind of the same idea. You have to request to Microsoft and say, hey, can you rehydrate this into a more current blob storage? And that can take 12, 24 hours to happen. And then you can look at the content from there. But you look at the price difference, it's almost 2 orders of magnitude, nearly 100 times cheaper than SharePoint storage. So if you've got a whole lot of content that you're just keeping from a legal compliance point of view, and unless you get involved in a lawsuit, you never need to look at it again, Blob Archive might be a good solution from that perspective. Now, like I said, this is not necessarily easy to manage. AvePoint's probably the best solution that I've seen around this, where they actually have a product to help manage this for you. And basically, it can identify content that's been flagged for archive, and it'll push it into the Azure Blob Storage. You can actually push it into other places, including hosted by AvePoint themselves if you want to. And it leaves a stub behind in SharePoint. So if somebody clicks on that file, says, I want to look at that file, it might take a little while. You probably wouldn't want to use the archive tier for this, but it'll basically pull the file back from the Azure storage into SharePoint, and then it'll light up for the user. So the experience of the user looks exactly the same, except it took a little longer to open that archived file. So it's a nice solution from that perspective. So it's things to think about from a storage cost management point of view. So when we're thinking about cleaning up unused resources, I mean, there's the documents themselves, but there's the broader workspaces. Like, can we clean this entire workspace out? And what does that mean? Do we want to clean out the entire team and the channels and everything related to that? In fact, there's a separate conversation around, sorry, little pun there, the conversation activity that's in those channels. Are you interested in archiving that? A lot of organizations are still not that mature in how they use Teams, and they're not having a lot of channel conversations, so they don't really care about what's in the channel. But if you've really embraced channels, like we have at Envision IT, we use them extensively for a lot of our sort of knowledge conversations that we want to capture and keep. Not, hey, Logan, are you free for lunch today? But, hey, Logan, what's our strategy around X or Y or something like that? We actually want to keep that and archive that. So we've built a tool for archiving those channel conversations. It's a little ugly right now. We're thinking about not productizing it, but maybe making it a free product that people can use to archive their channels if there's an interest there. Maybe you want to clean up the entire SharePoint site. OneDrive accounts, I mean, this is both something you need to be aware of, not just auto losing, because if you're not aware, if you delete a user's account or you remove their license because they're no longer with the organization, unless you've set up particular retention policies, their OneDrive is actually purged out after 30 days, I believe it is. So that's sort of an opposite problem you need to be concerned on. But if you've put holds on them or you've left their accounts deactivated and licensed, which we sometimes do just to keep the mailbox open, those OneDrive resources are going to stay there. And you probably want to look at cleaning those out. And deciding, well, what does that mean? Are we actually going to archive them? Are we just going to archive them somewhere else in SharePoint to kind of keep them easily available, but out of the day-to-day work, or are we actually going to delete them? And as I mentioned before, Purview is a good way to manage that. Now, the reason we're tagging this webinar in with the April one, Teams First Information Architecture, is this is a really good opportunity, not just to do some house cleaning, but to do some organization. So if you just rolled out teams and created a bunch of teams willy-nilly through COVID lockdowns and hadn't really stepped back and said, hey, is that the right architecture and structure for our organization? This is a good opportunity to look at that, to say, hey, let's figure out what that information architecture looked like. What does a team represent in our organization? I mean, there's the obvious team for each department, fits a lot of organizations. For us, we had the concept of a team for every client and a channel for every project, but then we found that sprawled too much and became unmanageable. So we're now, re-architecting, and we're actually going to be doing a tenant migration into that new information architecture over the next couple of months. And a key part of that is having some templates and automation. So we have a template for client sites and workspaces that we create that's done in a consistent way. So they all look the same from that point of view, and naming conventions and navigation, metadata all work well from that perspective. So end result from this, obviously storage savings is an important one there, but the out of date and duplicate content, I'd argue is even more important. The drain on productivity around confusion. I was just having a conversation with my CFO this morning, and finance people love this. They create new named versions of Excels every time they do something different. And I've got, I don't know how many different, forecasts for the business. There's version history in SharePoint. Let's keep one version of the truth. Let's eliminate the duplicates from that point of view. So I think we're there now, but that's common across organizations. And there's change management and training that goes with that to say, hey, we're making this effort to remove this duplicate content, but let's make sure we've got the understanding so that we don't end up back in the same place that we were at. And making sure that we've got responsibility for the content. Who are the owners for it from that perspective? So that's on the workspaces side. Let's flip gears and talk about permissions. Remember, we got those three pillars: those workspaces, permissions, and users. Let's dive into the permissions side of it. And there's actually a fair bit here as well. What are some of the common permission challenges? Sharing links are a big one. Microsoft has arguably done a great job of making it easy to share content with people in your organization and external to your organization. But they haven't always had things like expiry dates on those. So, you've got these sharing links that may have existed from a long time ago that shouldn't be there anymore. And this is where you get into oversharing. So being able to understand what those sharing links are and should they still be there? And if not, how do we clean them up? Is a big part of the permissions cleanup. Now, you may not be aware, Microsoft announced late last year, and they're rolling it out now through Q1 of calendar 25. If you purchase at least one license for Copilot for your organization, doesn't matter how big your tenant is, they will give you SharePoint Advanced Management for your whole tenant, which is reporting and tools to help with things like this. But in my opinion, there's still gaps here. Like they have reports around different styles of sharing links, but they'll only show you sharing links created in the last 28 days, which in my opinion is not very useful. The important ones to clean up are the ones that got created 5 years ago and nobody put an expiry on it, because 5 years ago you couldn't actually create an expiry date on it. And how do you clean those out? So it's something that we've really focused on in the tenant dashboard to say, hey, how many sharing links do we have? And we can drill down into different styles of workspaces or even into individual workspaces. and see those sharing links and understand what they are, and then make a decision, should they be cleaned up? Should they be changed around? I mean, we have a whole product called Extranet User Manager around creating groups and not using sharing links and managing it in a more structured way. Really, in our own tenant, we shouldn't have all these sharing links in there. So we got to clean those out from that point of view. But equally important is broken permissions. So in SharePoint, you have the ability at a document, at a folder, at a library level to say, I want to apply different permissions than the workspace as a whole. And there may be different reasons, and there may be valid reasons as to why you want to do that. In fact, if I come over to our Envision IT client site that I just created, one of the things that our automation integration between Bind Tuning and Envision IT that we built was the ability to set those permissions up and set some groups up around that. So what we do is we create an extra user manager group for each client, and we set permissions in the site around that. But if we look at our information architecture within our site, we create a bunch of folders around how we want to work with client engagements. And you'll see we've got a projects folder, and we create subfolders for the different project that we're doing on in there. We also have a private documents library, which is our place to have stuff that we're not necessarily ready to share, we don't want to share with the client. Budgets in progress, proposals in progress, things like that. So by default, clients get added to the group and they see this entire site structure, but we've broken the inheritance on private documents to say, no, we want slightly different permissions on that one there. And we can see that if I come into the permissions at the library level. So let me just go up to library settings in SharePoint here and more library settings and permissions for this document library. You see this big yellow flag. This is Microsoft saying, hey, you've broken permissions, and I can see what those items are. And our reasoning is we give read-only access to the site as a whole to our clients, but the projects folder, we give contributed access. We actually let our clients come in and co-author our spec documents and works in progress that we're working on. It works really well from a collaboration point of view. Whereas the private documents I mentioned, we don't want the clients to see into there. So we actually remove them entirely from a permissions point of view. So if I look at the permissions there, only owners have permissions into that library. Whereas if I'm back on the main one, members have read access. And if I look at the projects one, members have contribute access. So this is by design and it's okay, but there's lots of other places that you may have broken permissions and you want to be able to look at that. We haven't completely surfaced that up in the tenant dashboard yet. We have all the data underneath of every spot where permissions are broken. We just need to do something similar to the sharing links and say, hey, there's this many spots where permissions are broken. And part of your review would be, are those appropriate? Do they make sense? Or, should we clean those up and remove those? And particularly when you're archiving, you need to think about all those sharing links and all those broken permissions. Do you want to snapshot those in case you need to bring that site back because you shouldn't have archived it? Or do you need to understand who used to have access that's going to lose access as part of the archival process? So these all factor into the decision process. Another big one is this, it's not really a group, but it's a concept SharePoint has called everyone except external. It actually used to be called just everyone, and it included all your guests. And if you gave permission to something in SharePoint to that, literally everybody in your tenant had access to it. And they realized that was a big security hole. People were using it without realizing that every guest got access to what they were sharing, and they removed that and created this everyone except external. But it's still dangerous in the sense that basically you're saying, whatever content's secured to this, whether that's an entire workspace or just a folder of documents, literally everybody in the organization has visibility to that. And maybe somebody didn't intend to do that, and now they've overshared. So you should really review where that permission is used and potentially clean that up. Likewise, kind of related to that is public teams. So when you create a team, you can create what's called a private team or a public team. Public teams means that this everyone except external has access to the team. So basically everybody in the organization can see that team. And it makes a lot of sense in certain scenarios. Like we have a team at Envision IT call to operations, and it has a company updates and general in there. It's kind of our place. We don't use Viva Engage or Yammer. We're too small for that, but it's our spot to just share random thoughts and news and things like that within the organization. So we literally want that to be available to everybody from that perspective. So those are examples where it makes sense. But have you overdone that? Do people not realize the implication of choosing public over private and didn't set it up appropriately from that point of view? So I was thinking I had an hour here. I've only got 45 minutes, so I better pick up the pace here. Purview information protection is something I've done past webinars on. It's really important as part of this. It's actually not that hard to roll out something like the traffic light protocol and apply policies and rules around who can share and what that looks like from that point of view. So I encourage you to check out resources that we have on that side. From the user side, this one's actually a little more straightforward. You have two types of users. You have members, which are typically staff within your organization, and you have guests, which are typically people from outside of your organization. Some people invite frontline staff that aren't licensed in as guests, and as long as you play by the rules and don't bring those people into Microsoft 365, you can do that, but let's just generally consider those outside people. So things we want to look at there, sometimes member accounts get set up for devices, for service accounts, for things like workflows and things like that. Maybe there's unlicensed users in there. Maybe there's no recent activity because this person doesn't actually work for the organization anymore. They've been deactivated. So looking for those and saying, hey, should we tidy some of those up? And I know we have some in our tenant that we need to tidy up, so we're going to tackle that. But same thing from a guest point of view. Maybe you've got a guest that, as far as you can tell, has no permissions to anything in SharePoint or Teams. Maybe they exist for a different reason, and that's valid, but they don't belong to any groups or don't belong to any permissions. Why are they there? Maybe there's no recent activity, or maybe they've actually never signed in. It's not uncommon to invite a bunch of people from an organization and only some of those engage. The other ones never actually come in. Do you leave those accounts there, or do you clean them out because it's been 2 years since you invited them and they haven't done anything? They really don't make sense. So things to think about from a user cleanup point of view. But let's circle back to the case study for City of Greater Sudbury. So I mentioned the stats at the top here. Where did we get to? We basically halved the number of workspaces, and that was through a combination of sort of test ones, dummy ones, test ones that were set up in there that could just get deleted. There was a bunch of merges that happened. There was some archives that happened. So really simplified their structure and organization, and more importantly, by using orchestry and governance going forward, helping to keep it organized and having policies around who can request a new workspace and what template can they use, and does there need to be an approval process around that to really keep some structure around that. So key takeaways, there's a lot here, and like anything, if you've ever dealt with a hoarder in the real world, I've dealt with some of that from a family estate point of view. It's not fun. It can be overwhelming, but you got to pick your battles and say, hey, maybe we can't solve all of this, but can we solve some of it? Can we choose one thing? Are we going to look at the workspaces? Are we going to look at the permissions? Are we going to look at the users? Pick one area from there. And it's important to start by gathering the data, understand the scope of the problem that you're trying to solve, and then how do you narrow that down into more reasonable boxes from there. There's a bunch of resource links here to the tenant dashboard itself, to our services around Teams First Information Architecture and Copilot readiness, articles around preventing oversharing, article on the traffic light protocol that I talked about there. And we've got next month's webinar, so that's Tuesday, April 15th. Same time range. Actually, Bind Tuning, Beatrice and Carlos are going to be joining me for that webinar. We're actually really busy through the spring. We've got lots of conferences coming up, the Toronto one, but I'm going to be speaking in Germany. We've got the webinar in London, England, Vegas, Vienna, so it's going to be kind of all over the map from there. Apologies, I didn't really leave time for questions from that point of view, but Logan, I don't know if you were watching the chat, if there's specific things we want to take our remaining 1 minute and look back at.
Yeah, so there's one question from Paul around commenting on Personal Vault for business, the usage of Personal Vault's OneDrive.
I'm assuming, yeah, you're referring to within OneDrive. I like to caution the use of OneDrive in general. Like if you're building a whole folder structure that you're sharing up with a project team out of your OneDrive, that's a big flag to say, you know, that should be a workspace in Teams or in SharePoint from that point of view. The personal vault is a spot to keep, you know, highly confidential information that's you only as part of that. I don't use it too much myself. We're a big 1Password shop, so anything from a, you know, keys and secrets and passwords point of view that you might want to keep in the personal vault, I defer to using 1Password from that point of view. So that's really my only take on that. Sorry, Paul, I don't have a whole lot more from that perspective. So Logan?
Sorry, I was going to say, and Doug had asked around if we have time, which we don't, we're right at the top of it, but could we speak more to Teams first? You know, he's found it tough to manage for organizing work, which I know there's lots of gripe around search and Teams.
Yes. So I would defer that one to the Teams First IA that we're going to be doing in a month or so from now. There is past versions of that webinar, so you could actually go check them out from that point of view, and happy to have a side conversation on that topic. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We're at the 45-minute spot. I appreciate everybody tuning in and joining in. I hope that was useful. I hope I didn't sort of overwhelm and kind of scare you into not doing anything. You know, just pick some little wins there and start to move forward from a tenant cleanup and get the spring cleaning going. We're going to do the same. I've actually set a personal goal to say, can we get some of our spring cleaning done before the April 11th webinar? So if you're tuning back into that one, call me to task and say, hey, how did you do? How's the Envision IT tenant doing from that point of view? So with that, I'll say thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.